Hey guys, it's Symmetry here with the first of a new series for this channel, the 100% Review. A series where I will 100% a game and then review it from an achievement or trophy hunter's perspective. Episode 1 here is a real beauty with Cyberpunk 2077. A game I must admit I avoided quite heavily back when it released in 2020, but I'm so very glad that I've come back and experienced it now. So let's jump in with a quick overview of what the game is like nearly 4 years after its initial release. Cyberpunk is a first-person action-adventure RPG that takes its setting and lore from a tabletop game, which is something I didn't actually know prior to looking into this video. The game itself is set in Night City and the surrounding Badlands, with the expansion Phantom Liberty also adding the district of Dogtown into the fray. Now let's quickly talk about the technical state of the game. Update 2.0 has revamped most of the systems within the game, as well as fixed most of the technical issues. I will say that in the roughly 90 hours that I did play this game to 100%, I experienced one freeze that resulted in me needing to restart the game, and about 3 visual glitches, all of which were related to people holding guns in ways they definitely shouldn't. I wouldn't advise holding your gun through your chest to shoot out your back. Bit of an interesting choice. So yeah, at this point in time, the game is very much playable. Bear in mind, I did play exclusively on the PlayStation 5. I do believe Update 2.0 did raise the system requirements for PC players from the original PC specs back in 2020. From here, let's jump into the story and my thoughts on it. There will of course be some spoilers here, so brace for these or skip to the next section in the timestamps below. Cyberpunk 2077's story revolves around our character V, who we can create via an actually really solid character creator. V has 3 potential origin stories. They're all fairly unique and they do greatly alter the first couple hours of the game. The Nomad starting point has V in the outskirts of the city, the Badlands, whilst the Street Kid has V doing odd jobs and small-time gigs in the streets of Night City around Haywood. Finally, the Corpo does start V viciously climbing the ladder of the corporation he's involved with, and I do think that this is probably my favourite of the 3, with the Nomad one being the weakest and the Street Kid just kind of being a bit of a midpoint. From here, V does meet a really good cast of characters. They're all fairly memorable. I think Jackie is probably going to be most people's favourites out of the gate. He is a fantastic starting introduction character. And we wind up being a merc in Night City, where we mostly take illegal odd jobs with the dream of hitting the big time. This ultimately leads us working a heist on the Arasaka Corporation, which is a global corporation. This of course goes south and we are forced to install the biochip that we've been tasked with stealing on ourselves. We actually do die during this heist before the biochip does kick in. This biochip actually turns out to be an engram of a man named Johnny Silverhand, a former legend of Night City that attacked Arasaka himself some 50 odd years ago before the start of this story. He was caught by Arasaka in the process and he was placed on this chip. He's also Keanu Reeves. Now, due to our death, the biochip is now leeching on V, and it will ultimately kill him. There's nothing V or Keanu Reeves can do to stop this, and so we begin to start looking around for any real options that we have in either curing this or just delaying the inevitable. Ultimately, the rest of the story here is pretty linear. I know the game was marketed as having these deep and favourable choices. It doesn't really happen here. You can take some missions in different orders. You can choose to kill some sort of minor characters, or you could bribe them, etc, etc. But these don't really affect the story in any meaningful way. The base game does have 3 different endings. Each of these endings does have some variations on them. However, these essentially just boil down to a choice that's made just before the final ending, and then the variation that you get is kind of tied to the side quests that you've done with certain characters and things like that. The DLC, however, Phantom Liberty, does bring in an additional 4 endings and then kind of like a additional secret, or not really secret, but final ending on top of 2 of those endings, which is cool. That does add some sort of major choices, but we're talking about the base game at the moment, and it doesn't really have any of that sort of impact on choices that are made through the campaign. I must say, I do really like how your starting path can alter some of the events during the story, sometimes allowing you to convince someone of a plan or to outright avoid certain sections of combat. My main character that I played started as the street kid, and this often allowed me to bully things like drug dealers or rippers into siding with me or letting me pass through a checkpoint without needing to initiate a fight or bribe them or something like that. Your skill upgrades can also play an effect here. You know, they can often, if you invest in the body one, for example, you can rip open doors, but I'll sort of discuss that more in a later part of the review here. The only other two big choices that affect much are befriending Johnny Silverhand. This doesn't really lock you out of anything. It does advance one of the three endings quite significantly, and it does kind of give you an ultimate ending where just you and Johnny take on the big bad guys at the end. The other choice is to save Takamura towards the end of the story. Now, Takamura has been a character that we've sort of been tied to the whole way through. He's sort of been brought into this sort of bad situation with Arasaka because of some choices that you and the bad guys have made. He's been dragged in, and the two of you are trying to work a way out of this situation. There is a point towards the end of the story where the two of you are assaulted by the bad guys, and you are quite actively told to flee from the situation, just get out of there, get out of Dodge. You can go back and save Takamura. This is also linked to one of the endings in the game, so it is something that you definitely do want to do. However, outside of just that ending, and if you are an achievement hunter, this really does not impact anything either outside of maybe the odd phone call with him down the track. One negative I do have towards the story is that the opening act of the game does go on a little long. In terms of the pacing, the story itself is quite short. I wouldn't say it really goes past sort of the 15-20 hour mark. And so if you are just gunning through the story, quite a bit of it actually takes place in a very small part of the city, which means that if you are just doing the main story, you aren't really expanding out and seeing a lot of what the world can give you. And I do find this to be a bit of a missed opportunity. I do think that some of these missions probably should have been spread out a bit more and really utilize Night City. Night City is fantastic. However, here you are kind of railed into a limited area, at least for the opening act of the game. Something the game does incredibly is just interaction with other characters. It might actually be the best I've ever seen in a game, period. This game really tries to make interacting with other characters feel very real. From sending and receiving text messages between missions, to hanging out with your partner in the game outside of missions and doing things like watching movies together, which was a nice little flashback to the first Darkness game where you can watch To Kill a Mockingbird with your partner in there. I thought that was very, very cool. To even just the little detail in animations during cutscenes. For example, you might have a cutscene where you and another character are meeting to discuss a plan of getting into a nightclub to extract a character or some data or something like that. And this interaction is done at a noodle bar where the other character is eating and sort of prioritizing their eating while also distributing the information. I sort of found this very cool. It felt very real, as opposed to a lot of other games where you'll just have the other character standing in front of you and just speaking towards you, as opposed to the conversation being part of an interaction also with the world itself. I thought this was very, very unique. I don't see this too often in other games, and I really, really enjoyed it here. I thought this was definitely something that brought me into the game, brought me into the characters, and made a lot of them a lot more memorable than in other titles that I've played. So to summarize, the story is good fun. The setting and the endings are fairly grim. They're definitely very, very dark here, but I guess that does fit the setting well, and while the choices largely don't matter, they do exist, and some of the outcomes play out on minor characters in a really great and unique way. From here, let's dive into the progression and skill systems. At the very start of the game, you'll assign V some attributes. There are 5 attributes that can be invested into, these being body, intelligence, reflexes, technical ability, and cool. Each of these attributes has a skill tree tied directly to its leveling, and each level can be increased up to a point of 20 points. Each attribute also increases a base stat of V's. For example, the body stat increases V's HP, whilst the technical stat increases his base armor stat. I believe this has been changed from the launch version of the game, where these small stat boosts were tied to the sort of the clothing that you wore, which these days is more simply a cosmetic choice to just define what your character's actually wearing. As mentioned earlier, your attribute level can at times affect how outcomes play out. For example, I maxed out the body attribute early because I was running a melee build. The side benefit of this was my character had the strength to brute force his way through locked doors, whilst someone who maxes out intelligence or the technical tree has more of an affinity with the computers around the world, things like control panels and stuff like that, and you're able to hack your way through a door, or you might not even need other characters to do the hacking for you. You can just do it yourself, as opposed to a strength-based build that is going to need another character and hire them on to do a scenario for them, which I thought was very unique. With the DLC, you can reach a max level of 60, meaning that you can come quite close to maxing out all of the attributes. You can't quite get 100% on all of them, but you do get very, very close. I think I had 3 trees pretty much maxed out and the other ones not too far off. You can also reset the progression of these if you do have a change of heart. I think you can only do this once. I'm not entirely sure on that. I know that in my playthrough, I definitely did it once, and then the option to reset no longer was there, so I assume it is a one and done, but it might also be a case of you can then go and buy, say, an item that'll sort of replenish the ability to reset them. I am not entirely sure on that front. Another big factor of progression, however, is the skill system. There are 5 of these, and they're essentially tied directly to how you play the game. For example, the Headhunter skill levels as you, believe it or not, kill enemies with headshots, whilst the Shinobi skill is leveled by doing things like killing someone with bladed weapons, such as the Mantis Blades or katanas and things like that, but it is also leveled passively just by doing things like running, double jumping, sliding, and dodging during combat. These can all have a max level of 60 as well. There is an achievement tied directly to maxing out one of these stats. This achievement, funny enough, was also the last trophy that I needed for the platinum. Cyberware is also worth mentioning here. These are essentially cybernetic body alterations that can be bought at a Ripper Doctor, and they do provide stat bonuses as well as some gameplay alterations. Reinforced tendons, for example, allow the player to double jump, which not only is very fun to do, I found myself using this as my main transportation anytime I didn't need a car. I loved it, to be perfectly honest with you, especially when I combined this with one that allowed me to dodge forward, so I could double jump into a dash through the air, which was very fun to do. But they can also be used to manipulate yourself around the environment in ways you could not do so previously. One fact that comes to mind immediately is one of the relic points from the DLC. You actually do need this double jump, which is called reinforced tendons, to reach a location that is normally out of height. It is impossible any other way to my knowledge. The Mantis Blades are another favourite of mine. You have retractable blades in your arms, essentially, that come out during combat. And as a melee build for most of the game, I did find that I did preference these quite a lot. Each cybernetic has a tier associated to it, with normal items getting basic stat boosts, with legendary items getting the best stat boosts. These are usually fairly significant. A level 1 item might get a 20% headshot multiplier, whilst a legendary one might get a 280% multiplier, for example. This tier system is also shared with most of the weapons as well. Weapons and utilities are very varied, with 3 weapon slots and 2 quick access slots for things such as health upgrades and grenades, and of course the clothing that is just purely cosmetic. Weapons like cybernetics are upgradable up to tier 5, however I did find that by the end of the base game, I was just picking up new legendary weapons left and right. You also do hit a point where most things are fairly easy in the game, so I found myself just kind of switching weapons to keep things fresh, which was largely enjoyable. Weapons can also, on top of this, be modded with things such as scopes or silencers, but I honestly rarely did this. I think I might have added a scope to one sniper rifle in the entire game, and I think I added a silencer to a pistol a couple of times just to try and do some sort of Mission Impossible style things, or I snuck into a base and tried to pick off as many people as I could without anyone seeing me. Crafting does exist in the game, however is very secondary compared to how it was with the launch version of the game. In my time with Cyberpunk, I literally only used this for ammo top-ups when I was using guns, and to get the achievement tied to crafting a level 5 item 3 times. Overall, I like everything on offer here. I like the variety that comes with how the skill system interacts with each other and how it passively levels throughout how you play. I do like that a lot of this is tailored to the way that you do play, and it kind of means that you don't really have to think too hard about it. It kind of just is very natural and very smooth. The skill system also suits the setting really well, and it doesn't feel out of place. Difficulty is up next before we discuss the gameplay and world of Cyberpunk. And yeah, this is an open world RPG. There's not really much difficulty to have, to be honest, besides the very hard difficulty. Yes, there are several difficulty sliders. However, even on hard, you'll simply out-level and out-gear enemies. They do scale to your level, but I just found that kind of meant they had maybe 3 extra bullets before they died, as opposed to how much damage they dealt to me personally. By sort of the end of the base game, I could kind of walk around fairly freely and just sort of slaughter enemies at free will without really worrying too much about my health. I didn't play too much on very hard. I did play different parts of the games on the different difficulties to sort of experience how they all differ, and honestly, it was mostly just sort of enemy sponge was the big factor here. Most of the trophies, for example, can be earned on any difficulty, and difficulty really isn't a factor outside of just how hard you want to make the game yourself, which it kind of reminded me of The Witcher 3, where very hard, for example, was akin to Deathmarch, for example, where in the early game is very difficult. Witcher 3, I always found literally the very first combat encounter of the entire game was the only difficult one on Deathmarch besides the odd werewolf. Same sort of case here. Early game's difficult until you develop a bit of a build, and then the game sort of wildly swings into your favor. That said, it is time to talk about the world. Night City is our setting here. It's a sort of futuristic and dystopian world set in 2077. This setting itself is dripping with lore, and I do love the way the world itself feels like a character. This at times can be quite difficult to achieve for open world games, where sometimes it more just feels like the open world there itself exists to exist. A good example of this is England in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, whereas the city itself here is divided into several districts, each of which is typically run by a gang. These all feel very unique to one another. I could definitely, after the 90 hours I've spent with this game, I can definitely pinpoint exactly which district is which, and I could move around the map quite fluidly without ever really needing to look up the map. This is a nice thing I was able to do. This is something that doesn't really happen in a lot of open world games, I find. The districts themselves are filled with gigs. These are typically just short world events such as rescuing someone from a gang, robbing a gang, or etc. There are NCPD crime events scattered through the districts that boil down to essentially go here, kill X enemies, and pick up Y data file. I liked these a lot less than the gigs. These are actually probably one of my biggest complaints about the entire game. They ultimately just feel like bloat. You also need to do all of these in every single district for the trophies/achievements, which is not particularly fun. There are also actual side quests here, and a lot of these were probably my favorite quests in the game. Some of these are actually really in-depth, and the choices here do affect the characters directly. Again, there are trophies and achievements tied directly to some of these side quest storylines, and the decisions you make do actually lock you out of the trophies. For example, Judy Alvarez's, if you make certain choices around some of the decisions she requires you to make, you'll end her story prematurely and not be able to earn the trophies. The ending to it that is early actually does feel quite natural. I did accidentally earn that the first time and have to reload my save. The police will also step in if you do run about causing chaos, and there is a wanted system akin to, say, Grand Theft Auto. I did really like that the district you commit a crime in also affects how fast the police respond. For example, if you create a crime in Watson or Pacifica, there's a good odds they're just not going to show up at all, or they're going to take their sweet time getting to you. Now, if you do decide to go on a full rampage mode, you will eventually be hunted down by MaxTac, the Cyber Psycho Response Unit. These guys actually mean business. Regardless of your build and the difficulty the game is currently being played on, they have a flat difficulty and are very capable of taking you down. These guys will kill you very, very quickly, trust me. And a lot of this goes a long way to making Night City feel dynamic and alive, which I personally really appreciate in an open world. The map does also feature fast travel, and there's an abundance of fast travel locations. One trophy is actually directly tied to finding every fast travel point. Good luck doing this without some sort of interactive map, and there are well over 100 locations that do need to be found. Fast travel is of course not the only way that you can get around the city. The driving itself feels great and sounds even better. I did really like that the vehicles all feel unique to drive and that you can collect quite a few of the vehicles, which is also tied to a trophy. I also loved the inclusion of a rail system you can sit on. There's not much you can really do here outside of just look out the window or move to the door, but as someone who does commute via train to work every single day, this was a nice touch that made me sort of feel a little bit at home, and it was nice sort of seeing a futuristic take on something that I do have to do every single day. Now, all of this does not make the city 100% perfect. Probably my biggest gripe is how the gangs are handled. I would have liked to have seen some sort of notoriety system here, possibly like, say, the Shadow of Mordor Nemesis system. As of now, you can slaughter hundreds of these gang members and no one bats an eye. You can just walk past them down the street. They're not going to initiate conflict unless you get too close. The gangs really only exist here to be tied to side quests and to give the player combat encounters should they feel like finding them. Overall though, I do adore Night City. I love the depth to the secrets to be found within. I love that the city itself feels like a character. The contrast between the city and the world is fantastic. Ultimately, Night City is up there among the heavyweights of open world maps to me. But now let's talk about how the combat works. So combat is essentially as simple or complex as you'd like it to be, and it's viable regardless of the option that you take. You can exclusively play a melee brute that rushes in and fully ignores cybernetics, whilst you could also play a ghost who camouflages and uses quick hacks to pick off enemies while remaining untraceable. And what is nice is you can swap between the styles without too heavily handicapping yourself. I found myself switching between playstyles quite a bit towards the end of my run and found them all enjoyable. The bulk of my gameplay was from a melee standpoint. I just really liked the blades in this game. I found the finishes and things like that really satisfying. But towards the end of the game, I think my final sort of quote-unquote build by the end was just a double-barrel shotgun that I would just walk in sort of Judge Dredd style, and then while I was shooting people that was often one hit killing them, I'd also quick hack a lot of the turrets and things around me to turn on the enemies as well, kind of like an ultimate chaos terminator, I guess. One of the cool things about the quick hacks that I just mentioned as well is you can combo them if you do invest enough into your net running perks. Quick hacks are things like if there's a security camera, you can take control of it yourself, you can turn it off, you can make it trigger the turrets that then attack enemies. The turrets themselves will be controllable as well. I often really liked to take them, like I just said, and turn them on the enemies myself. This was an aspect of the game I kind of initially ignored, but towards the end I was invested in quick hacking. I thought it was probably one of my favorite parts about the entire thing. The combat is ultimately very fluid and enjoyable. I found myself still enjoying enemy encounters right up until I hit the 100%, which is something I find open world games and even just a lot of modern games in general do struggle with. The combat does get very stale over time. A good recent example of this for me would be Hogwarts Legacy, where I essentially used the same 3 spell combos the entire game, and by the end I was just trying to avoid combat where I could. But now it's time for the Phantom Liberty DLC, a large expansion and the only expansion I believe Cyberpunk is getting. If there is one thing the DLC does far better than the base game, it is the choice and consequence. Whilst I did find the main story does get a little bit linear with a fairly minor choice of consequence, we see it really dialed in here and expanded upon. There are 4 new endings, 2 of which extend the runtime of the story and do ultimately give you secret little endings and things like that, which I thought was very, very cool. I love the overall story here. I personally found the plot a lot more interesting than the base game's plot, and Idris Elba has done a wonderful job portraying the character of Reed. He and me were bros forever. Both he and Keanu Reeves knock it out of the park with their characters in this game. A 6th attribute is also added with this DLC in the Relic Tree. This tree enhances your cyberware skills, and it unlocks differently to every other attribute in the game where you new vest levels as you level up your character. These are found exclusively on the map. I believe there's about 11 of them. Some of them are given to you during the story actually as well, but the rest you have to find in little sort of caches in the map. This was actually my final trophy I earned for my 100% completion, which was pretty cool. Now, the other big inclusion to this DLC is the district of Dogtown. Dogtown is a fairly small area, however is jam-packed with content that typically was of a higher quality to the base game's activities. Dogtown was overtaken by a rogue military unit sometime before the events of the game and is run with an iron fist by Hansen. The story for this DLC revolves around this Hansen character and his conflict with the new United States government. The Air Force One plane is effectively shot down above Dogtown, and as a result, V is pulled into the drama and subsequent spy-like campaign. We can even make choices that directly lead to you being inducted as a special agent for the president. Either way, Phantom Liberty is a very worthy expansion to Cyberpunk and improves on a lot of the details from the base game. It expands on characters, introduces some fantastic characters, and provides a very entertaining spy plot that I really just genuinely hope CD Projekt Red expands upon in the future Cyberpunk 2. Up next is the trophies and achievements. If you know me, you know I am a trophy hunter. I've been doing trophies and achievements for about 15 years now, which is the bulk of my gaming life. I love these things. I play most titles on PlayStation, and I do my best to earn every single trophy. However, I do also dabble in PC Steam achievements, which we'll see more so in the future, especially with some indie horrors that just don't get releases on the PlayStation, for example. As such, I often look at games from a completionist's perspective, and Cyberpunk is no exception. Cyberpunk has a really solid trophy and achievement list here. It is interchangeable across all major platforms and will take roughly 65 to 70 hours to complete. I think for me it was exactly 72 hours. The game does feature several missable trophies that are tied mostly to the endings of the game, the endings of the DLC, or side quests. However, these can largely be balanced by using the many save slots within the game to create tactical save points that can then be reloaded if you do need. I had to use these several times because I would lock myself out of the side quests. There are trophies tied to completing every side gig and NCPD scanner event in every single district, and these are by far the most grindy part of the game. The NCPD events in particular, they just feel like they exist to increase the runtime and feel like typical open world bloat that we do see in modern games. I would expect this more in an Ubisoft open world. We have some skill progression trophies tied to reaching the max level of a skill, maxing out our street cred, etc., and these will mostly all come naturally. There are also quite a few combat-related trophies. Off the top of my head, there's one for shooting a grenade mid-air with a revolver, or there's another one, for example, for killing 2 enemies with 1 sniper bullet. There's also a few for killing X amount of enemies whilst time is slowed down and using some of your cybernetic abilities, which I did appreciate. The trophy for killing every cyber psycho is a favourite of mine, as each of these was essentially a little mini-boss encounter with a uniquely cybernetically altered man, and these were often accompanied by a little side story or lore. A notable one that stood out to me, for example, was one where a group of people was filming a reality TV show wedding when a cyber psycho jumped in and slaughtered them all. It was kind of a bit of an interesting one. It was down on a dock in, I believe, Pacifica off the top of my head, and it was a really cool one. It was definitely a highlight and a memorable little piece of open world lore right there. One trophy to watch out for is the trophy for buying every vehicle in the game. Now, this actually does not apply to every single vehicle, as many were added post the game's launch and don't actually count for the list. You can find the list in guides online of the actual cars that you need, but you do actually need to accumulate over 1.3 million eddies, which is the currency in the game, to achieve this. By the end of my 100%, I had about double that. I think I had about 2.7 million eddies, but it is something to be mindful if you are, say, someone who buys a lot of stuff during a campaign run, like if you buy new guns or you want to buy the cybernetics and stuff, these will add up, which could potentially mean that you do have to grind some eddies towards the end. Ultimately, the trophy/achievement list is largely made up of things that you would just do naturally whilst playing through the game, mixed with some story outcomes and some checkbox cleanup, such as do everything in each district. There's nothing really challenging here, and everything can be achieved on the easiest difficulty. I'd say the trophy list in terms of a difficulty is probably about a 3 or a 4 out of 10. It's mostly just time-consuming things than actual skill-based stuff, and I can see a lot of people not really having much difficulty in achieving any of these. So let's talk about some positives and negatives overall before we wrap this review up. On the positive side for me, the world hands down is the defining factor of this game, and Night City might just be the best crafted environment in an open world I've played. It's definitely up there. It feels very alive and very dynamic. I liked that the system progression and the variety of builds that you can create and swap between feels fluid. It didn't feel like too much of an effort to go from a melee character to a shotgun wielding character to someone with a smart gun. It didn't really feel difficult to switch between, and I do really appreciate that. It does ultimately make the combat a lot more refreshing and reduce it from ever going stale. For me, the only real negative is sometimes during the story, the game does get sidetracked. We go off on a tangent about brain dances, for example, which are these, it's a really cool concept. Essentially, you relive the memories of someone else and can feel what they feel, which does often lead to a lot of X-rated stuff in the side content. It really, in terms of the main story, doesn't get used outside of this one big focus on it early in the game, and I did find the gameplay to do with it is quite stale and quite sort of clunky, and we just never use it again. It kind of just feels like a bit of a side tangent that we got focused on, which is not ideal in a game that already has a relatively short story, in my opinion. And of course, the underutilized gangs, it really would have been nice to have seen some more depth to their existence outside of them just existing in the world so that you've got something to shoot at from time to time. The last negative that I have here on this list, of course, is the illusion of choice in the base game. This is somewhat fixed in the DLC, however, I still do find it frustrating on the base game's campaign, especially after the way that it was advertised by CD Projekt Red. Cyberpunk at this point in time is fantastic. It truly is a story of redemption post its 2020 launch date and joins games such as No Man's Sky and Assassin's Creed Unity in this regard. In saying this, I just would not buy the game at full price at this point in time. The game's lifespan is effectively over now that Phantom Liberty is out, and the game itself goes on sale all the time. Going in fresh was an absolute blast and an enjoyable experience as a completionist. I can recommend this to anyone looking to grab that sweet platinum or 100%. To bring this to a close now, this one is a must play. This is 100% that I can highly recommend. And of course, if you made it this far, thank you so much. Let me know how I went with my first ever actual attempt at a review. You can expect many more of these to come. Do subscribe if you enjoyed this, and I will see you on the next 100% review.